Imagine standing on a wooden bridge, staring down at this fast-moving river.
Right.
Your hands are tightly bound behind your back. There is a coarse, heavy hemp rope cinched tight around your neck.
A truly terrifying position to be in.
Yeah, and surrounding you are these soldiers standing in perfect, silent formation, just waiting for the commanding officer to give the signal to drop you. And as you wait for the planks to give way, you hear a sound. It's this agonizingly loud, slow, metallic clanging.
Like a hammer.
Exactly, like a blacksmith's hammer striking an anvil, but the space between each strike keeps getting longer and longer, and it takes a few terrified moments to realize what that sound actually is.
It's the ticking of your own pocket watch.
Yes, time is literally stretching out, distorted, and just breaking down right before you die.
And that distortion, that terrifying millisecond where reality completely fractures, is really where Ambrose Bierce lived his entire life.
Welcome to this deep dive. I am your host, and today we have a mystery to unpack for you that is going to take us into some incredibly dark, muddy, and frankly fascinating waters.
Oh, absolutely.
We are looking at a man who survived the absolute bloodiest, most nightmarish battles of the American Civil War.
Yeah.
A man who took that trauma and, essentially pioneered the entire genre of psychological horror.
He really did.
He went to war with corrupt, untouchable railroad barons in the press. He defined the cynical, razor-sharp humor of the Gilded Age. And then, and this is the craziest part, after doing all of that, at the age of 71, he rode a horse into the Mexican desert and simply vanished.
Just gone.
Without a single verified trace.
You know, the disappearance of Ambrose Bierce isn't just a historical footnote. It is really one of the great unresolved narratives of American history.
Right.
But the mystery of how his life ended is really just a reflection of the profound mystery of his character.
So, to get to the bottom of who this man was and what he actually left behind for you to read today, we've got an amazing stack of materials in front of us.
We really do.
We are pulling from comprehensive historical accounts, military records, and this brilliant academic analysis by Kyle Keeler that looks at the neurology of traumatic brain injuries and how they show up in Bierce's writing.
That paper is just fascinating.
It changes everything. We've also got essays from the Gettysburg Compiler regarding his private life, an extensive breakdown from the Columbia Journalism Review on his muckraking days, theories on his disappearance from LitHub, deep dives into weird fiction from scholar S.T. Joshi.
Oh, Joshi's fantastic.
Yeah, and finally, a look at how his legacy influenced Carlos Fuentes' masterpiece novel, Gringo Viejo.
And as we go through all this material, we really have to grapple with a central paradox about him.
The bitter Bierce thing.
Exactly. The public knew him as bitter Bierce. He was this misanthropic cynic. People always said his pen was dipped in acid. But the historical sources, the private letters, the psychiatric framing, they all suggest something entirely different.
So what was he then?
We are looking at a deeply traumatized, hypersensitive individual. He was fundamentally a jaded romantic.
Huh.
Yeah, he built this persona of biting satire and grotesque horror as this thick armor against a world that just kept breaking his heart.
Well, to understand why he needed that armor, we have to look at the fire that forged it.
Absolutely.
We have to march with him into the unimaginable horrors of the American Civil War. Let's set the scene for you here. It's 1861. Bierce is a 19-year-old farm boy from Ohio.
Just a kid, really.
Just a kid. And he's the youngest of 9 children, all of whom, by the way, were given names starting with the letter A.
Such a quirky little historical detail.
Yeah, his parents really committed to the bit, so he's full of youthful ideals. At the very first call for volunteers, he enlists in the Union Army's 9th Indiana Infantry.
And he doesn't just sign up and sit in a camp somewhere safely behind the lines.
Yeah.
He is plunged into the absolute meat grinder of the Western theater. We are talking about battles that still define the concept of American carnage. Shiloh, yeah. Chickamauga, Kennesaw Mountain, the Franklin-Nashville campaign.
Just brutal, brutal fighting.
Exactly. And his specific role during all this is incredibly crucial to understand. He served as a topographical engineer.
Now, I've always wondered about that. What does a topographical engineer actually do in the middle of a 19th century war?
Well, basically, they were the map makers for the Army.
Okay.
You have to think, this is an era before aerial reconnaissance. No satellite imaging, no drones.
Right, obviously.
So the commanding generals needed to know exactly what the terrain looked like before they committed tens of thousands of men to an attack.
They need to know what they're walking into.
Exactly. Where are the ridges? How deep is the river? Are there ravines where the enemy could hide artillery?
Oh, wow.
And to get that information, a topographical engineer like Bierce had to ride out far ahead of the friendly lines.
Wait, like out by himself?
Yes. He was out in the open, often entirely alone, methodically surveying the land while under direct, sustained fire from enemy pickets and snipers.
That is just, I mean, that requires a level of cold, calculated bravery that is hard to even fathom.
It really is.
Because you aren't charging with your brothers in arms in a massive wave of adrenaline.
No, not at all.
You are literally sitting on a horse with a sketchbook, trying to hold your hands steady while bullets are snapping past your head.
It was incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
And the military records show he was exceptionally brave. Take the Battle of Rich Mountain in 1862, for example.
What happened there?
So the Union forces are taking heavy fire. A comrade of Bierce's, a guy named Corporal Boothroyd, takes a bullet to the neck.
Oh, God.
Yeah, and he is bleeding out in what is effectively no man's land. Bierce leaves his cover, runs out into the open under concentrated enemy fire, grabs Boothroyd, and physically drags him back to the safety of the Union lines.
And he didn't have to do that. That wasn't his job.
Not at all. He was officially decorated for that action.
So he's effective. He's incredibly brave. But he is just soaking in an unprecedented level of human destruction day after day.
Right.
And then we hit 1864, the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. This is really the pivot point of his entire existence.
It changes everything. During the fighting at Kennesaw Mountain, Bierce suffers a severe traumatic brain injury.
A TBI.
Yes. A Confederate sniper's bullet strikes him right in the head. It actually fractures his skull.
Let's pause and talk about the medical reality of the 1860s here for you listening, because I think we hear bullet to the head and we immediately imagine modern trauma wards, MRI machines.
Right, neurosurgeons.
Yeah. But what actually happens to a soldier with a severe TBI in a Civil War field hospital?
Essentially nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. Civil War medicine was practically medieval when it came to neurology. If you took a bullet to the arm or the leg, they amputated it to prevent gangrene.
Sure, we've all seen the movies.
Right. If you took a bullet to the gut, they gave you morphine
Yeah.
and just waited for you to die.
Rude.
And if you took a bullet to the skull, well, assuming it didn't kill you instantly, they might pick out the bone fragments, bandage it up, and simply observe you.
They just watched him.
That's all they could do. They had zero understanding of brain swelling, zero understanding of the frontal lobe or the temporal lobe.
Wow.
Bierce survived, which is a miracle in itself, honestly. But the medical establishment had no way to treat the unseen cognitive aftermath.
So he was left with these lifelong physical and psychological scars. The sources note he developed severe chronic asthma that plagued him until the day he died.
Yeah.
He had what doctors at the time would have dismissed as a surger's heart or maybe a lack of moral fiber.
Which is such a tragic way to frame it.
It is. But what we now clearly recognize as profound post-traumatic stress disorder layered right on top of the lingering neurological damage of a severe TBI.
And this is where the Gettysburg Compiler piece becomes so vital for our understanding of him.
Yeah, break that down for us.
The author argues that we really have to strip away the bitter Bierce caricature. If you look at the accounts of people who knew him intimately, like his publisher and close friend Walter Neal, a completely different portrait emerges.
Right, because the public just saw this angry guy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Neal explicitly stated that Bierce's reputation for brutality lived entirely on the printed page.
Just in his writing.
Yes. In private, Bierce abhorred cruelty. He was remarkably compassionate. Neal even noted that Bierce was prone to crying frequently.
A weeping misanthrope.
It's quite the image.
It's such a striking contradiction.
Yeah.
To be this feared, cynical writer, but privately you're just weeping all the time.
It leads right into the theory proposed by C. Hartley Grattan, who wrote a biography of Bierce back in 1929.
Okay.
Grattan's thesis is that Bierce actually started out as an ardent romantic.
Really?
Yes. He believed in the nobility of the human spirit. He believed in the grand cause of the war. But the sheer scale of the slaughter he witnessed, capped off by his own devastating brain injury, well, it shattered those ideals completely.
So the bitterness was a reaction.
Exactly. His post-war fury, the venom he later poured into his writing, was a volatile, almost allergic reaction against a world that refused to live up to his romantic expectations.
It makes me think of an oyster.
An oyster.
Yeah, an oyster has this incredibly soft, highly sensitive biological center, right? It's completely vulnerable.
Sure.
And when an irritant gets inside, like a grain of sand or a parasite, the oyster doesn't just sit there. It secretes a hard, calcified shell over the irritant to protect its soft tissue.
Ah, I see where you're going.
Bierce's cynical exterior was the shell. The war was the irritant that nearly destroyed his mind. He had to build that thick, jagged layer of cynicism just to survive in society without being completely crushed by the sheer weight of his own empathy.
That's a great analogy. The shell protects the organism, but to anyone looking from the outside, it just appears to be a sharp, unyielding rock.
But I do want to push back on this a little bit because I want to make sure we are really grappling with the darkness of his work.
Fair enough.
If he is this secretly weeping, sensitive romantic who just wants to protect his feelings, how do we explain the actual content of his stories?
They're very dark.
They're horrifying. His biographer, Richard O'Connor, noted that Bierce's work is filled with, quote, headless bodies and boar-eaten corpses.
Yeah, that's accurate.
When you read his war fiction, it is drenched in gore and incredibly dark irony. So I have to ask, does a sensitive romantic really write a scene about wild pigs eating the face off a dead soldier?
It seems contradictory, I know. But it actually makes perfect sense when you understand his philosophy of literature.
How so?
Bierce absolutely despised the literary movement of realism that was gaining popularity in the late 19th century.
Okay, writers like William Dean Howells.
Exactly. They were trying to depict everyday life exactly as it was. Very dry, very observational. Bierce hated that.
He had a great quote about that, didn't he?
He did. He called realism the art of depicting nature as it is seen by toads.
That is just a fantastic insult, but why did he hate it so much?
Because for Bierce, simply reporting the dry, objective facts of a battle, how many men marched where, how many casualties fell, it didn't convey the emotional and psychological truth of the experience.
It missed the point.
Right. The American public in the late 1800s loved to romanticize the war. They built grand monuments. They talked endlessly about the glory of the fallen, the nobility of sacrifice.
It was this beautiful, tragic pageant.
Exactly. And Bierce looked at people talking about honor who had never actually seen a man's skull split open by a cannonball, and he was disgusted.
So he forces them to look at the boar-eaten corpses.
He absolutely weaponizes the horror. He uses the grotesque violence deliberately to shatter the comforting, sentimental illusions of his readers.
Wow.
If you want to read about war, he's going to make you feel the nausea, the terror, and the absolute indignity of a battlefield death.
Which brings us to a really fascinating biological intersection in our deep dive today.
Yes, the neurology.
Right, because that trauma, specifically the bullet that struck his head at Kennesaw Mountain, didn't just give him grim material to write about.
No, it went much deeper.
According to the academic analysis by Kyle Keeler in our sources, the brain injury fundamentally altered the biological way Bierce perceived time and reality.
It's a groundbreaking way to look at his work.
And because of that, he ended up inventing entirely new structures for telling a story.
The neurological mechanism here is crucial for you to grasp. Keeler argues that Bierce's TBI created a literal break in the mind's experience of time.
The break in time.
Yeah. When you suffer a severe concussive head wound, you lose consciousness. You fall into a void.
Right.
And when Bierce woke up from his coma-like state, he was waking up to a world that was violently different from the one he left an instant before.
How does it actually affect the brain long term, though? I think we all understand the concept of flashbacks, but Keeler's talking about something deeper than just a flashback, right?
Keeler discusses the concept of competing temporalities.
Competing temporalities, okay.
Think of it this way. Biologically and physically, Ambrose Bierce survived the war. He moves to San Francisco. He sat at a desk in the 1880s wearing a nice suit, existing in the present.
A normal guy.
But psychologically, a massive part of his cognitive processing remained permanently anchored to 1864.
His brain was stuck.
His brain was stuck in the exact moment of his trauma. The timeline of his life didn't flow in a straight linear path anymore. The past and the present collapsed into each other.
And the incredible thing is, we see this exact neurological collapse translated directly onto the page.
We really do.
Let's talk about his most famous piece of fiction, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which was published in 1890. Kurt Vonnegut famously said that anyone who hasn't read it is a twerp.
Which is very Vonnegut. But he's right. It is arguably one of the most structurally perfect short stories in American literature.
Walk us through the plot of that, because the way he manipulates the reader's perception of time is just unbelievable.
So the story opens with a man named Peyton Farquhar. He is a wealthy Alabama civilian and a Confederate sympathizer. And he has been caught by the Union Army trying to sabotage a railroad bridge, Owl Creek Bridge.
The titular bridge.
Right. So he is standing on the edge of the bridge, a noose around his neck, about to be hanged. Bierce spends the first section methodically detailing the military execution process.
It's very cold, very clinical.
Extremely clinical. As Farquhar waits for the drop, his perception of reality starts to warp. That's when he hears that deafening clanging sound we talked about earlier, which turns out to be just the ticking of his pocket watch.
So his brain is already stretching out the seconds.
Exactly. Then the officer steps off the plank. Farquhar drops.
But the rope snaps?
The rope snaps. He plunges into the water below. He manages to free his bound hands. He tears the noose from his neck, and he swims to the surface.
And he's getting shot at, right?
Oh, yeah. He is dodging a hail of bullets and cannon fire from the soldiers on the bridge. And suddenly, his senses are hyper-sharpened.
Like superhuman, almost.
Yeah, he can see the individual veins on the leaves of the trees on the riverbank. He can see the gray eyes of the sniper looking at him through the rifle sights.
He makes it to the shore, he escapes into the dense forest, and he walks all day and all night.
It's an agonizing physical journey. He is exhausted. His neck is in immense pain from the noose. His eyes feel terribly congested.
He even starts hallucinating, doesn't he?
He does. He sees these strange, unfamiliar constellations in the sky. But he pushes through all this pain, driven entirely by the desire to get back to his wife and children.
Right.
Finally, he arrives at the gate of his own plantation. Everything looks beautiful and bright. He sees his wife stepping down from the veranda to meet him.
Happy ending.
He rushes forward with his arms open to embrace her. And just as he is about to touch her, he feels a devastating blow to the back of his neck.
Oh, man.
A blinding white flash, and then darkness and silence.
Because none of it happened.
None of it.
He never broke the rope. He never swam downstream. He never walked through the forest. The entire escape, with all its vivid sensory details and massive emotional stakes, happened entirely within his own mind in the single millisecond between being dropped from the bridge and the rope snapping his neck.
It's incredible. The story ends by simply stating that Peyton Farquhar's dead body is swinging gently from the timbers of Owl Creek Bridge.
It is a devastating twist, and it perfectly illustrates the concept of the swoon moment, right?
Yes. That's a term coined by scholar Laura Doyle, which Kyle Keeler applies directly to Bierce.
A swoon moment.
A character experiences a massive trauma, loses consciousness, and wakes up, or imagines waking up to a drastically altered world.
I see.
Farquhar's intense, detailed delusion is a psychological escape mechanism. His brain refuses to process the inevitability of death, so it stretches a fraction of a second into an agonizingly detailed alternate reality.
And the thing is, he does this over and over again. Look at the story, Chickamauga.
Oh, Chickamauga is deeply unsettling.
Step that one up for us.
It follows a young child who is deaf and mute, who wanders away from his plantation home with a little wooden sword.
Just playing in the woods.
Yeah. He plays in the forest, gets tired, and falls asleep. When he wakes up, there is that swoon moment again. The world is wrong.
What does he see?
He sees a parade of men crawling through the brush. They are horribly mangled, bleeding, missing limbs, just dragging themselves through the dirt. It's the aftermath of a massive, bloody battle.
But the child doesn't understand what he's looking at, does he?
He doesn't. He thinks it's a game. He actually tries to ride on the back of a soldier whose jaw has been blown off.
Oh, God.
He tries to lead this grotesque, silent parade like a playful general. Eventually, he follows the creeping men back to his own home, only to find the plantation burning to the ground.
And then it gets worse.
It gets much worse. He sees his mother, dead, her brains literally blown out. And because the child is deaf and mute, he cannot scream.
Right.
He cannot articulate the horror of what he is seeing. He can only make these awful, primal, inarticulate cries.
You know, that inability to speak, the inability to process the trauma, it feels so autobiographical. Bierce is using a child's perspective to show how senseless and completely incomprehensible war actually is.
Yeah.
And by using these structural tricks, jumping around in time, abandoning linear progression, trapping us inside the delusions of a dying mind, he is basically inventing the modern stream of consciousness narrative.
He really is. The influence of this specific structural invention, this false narrative continuation, it just cannot be overstated.
It's everywhere now.
Bierce pioneered the idea that the narrative we are reading might just be the fading firing of synapses in a dying brain. It influenced an entire century of literature.
Like who?
Well, Ernest Hemingway used it in The Snows of Kilimanjaro, where a dying writer hallucinates a rescue plane. William Golding used it in Pincher Martin, where a drowning sailor imagines his survival on a rock.
And I see it everywhere in modern pop culture, too.
Oh, yeah.
The film Jacob's Ladder is basically a feature-length adaptation of the Owl Creek Bridge concept. David Lynch plays with these subjective, fractured timelines in Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive.
Such good examples.
There is this devastating episode of the sitcom Scrubs called My Occurrence.
Oh, I remember that one.
Yeah. The main character spends the entire episode trying to fix a hospital clerical error, only to realize at the end that the whole episode was a fantasy his brain constructed to avoid the reality that his best friend actually has leukemia.
It's the exact same mechanism.
Or the Black Mirror episode playtest. An entire horrifying virtual reality sequence takes place in the 0.04 seconds before a phone call fries the protagonist's brain.
It's incredible.
It all traces back to Ambrose Bierce taking a sniper bullet to the skull. But I do want to throw a skeptical question your way here.
Sure, lay it on me.
Whenever we apply modern psychiatry to historical figures, we really risk over-pathologizing them.
We do.
Is it possible that Bierce was just a really clever writer who figured out that readers love a shocking plot twist?
That's a fair question.
Like, are we sure he is endlessly pathologically reliving his brain injury on the page rather than just cashing in on a really good formula?
It is a vital question to ask when doing historical analysis. And you're right, Bierce was certainly a master craftsman who loved manipulating his audience.
He knew what he was doing.
He did. However, the sheer repetition and the specific nature of the motifs suggest something much deeper than just a cheap trick.
How so?
The obsession with disjointed time, the recurring theme of waking up to horror, the way trauma repeats itself endlessly in his characters, it aligns far too perfectly with modern clinical definitions of traumatic brain injury and PTSD.
Right. I mean, he didn't have the psychiatric vocabulary to describe what was happening in his frontal lobe. They just called it soldier's heart.
Exactly.
Mm.
But he had his art. Through his literature, he was meticulously documenting the precise phenomenological experience of a TBI decades before the field of neurology had the tools to understand.
That's brilliant.
He is showing us, viscerally, how trauma collapses the boundaries, separating the past, the present, and the future.
So you have this man whose brain is literally locked in the violence of the Civil War, but he's physically sitting in a rapidly modernizing, deeply corrupt Gilded Age California.
Right.
He couldn't just write short stories to cope. He felt this intense, burning need to punish the hypocrites who were running society.
He had a lot of anger.
Fiction wasn't enough. He needed a real-world weapon, and he found it in journalism.
And he became arguably the most influential and certainly the most feared journalist on the West Coast.
Who was he writing for?
He worked predominantly for William Randolph Hearst's San Francisco Examiner. And he wasn't interested in being a detached, objective reporter.
He wasn't just reporting the news.
No, he was a crusader. He anticipated the great muckrakers of the early 20th century.
What was he attacking exactly?
Well, the Gilded Age was defined by massive economic inequality and rampant political corruption. H.L. Mencken later called it the Carnival of Buncombe.
Great phrase.
Bierce took aim at all of it. But his most legendary battle was his 1896 crusade against the Central Pacific Railroad and the men known as the Railroad Barons.
These were figures like Leland Stanford and Collis P. Huntington, right?
Exactly.
These guys were essentially the tech billionaires of their era. They had unlimited money and zero oversight.
They really did. They had received massive government loans to build the Transcontinental Railroad. But instead of paying the money back, they were quietly trying to push a funding bill through Congress that would essentially allow them to default on their debts entirely.
Just skip the bill?
Yeah. They were trying to orchestrate the legal theft of millions of dollars of public land and taxpayer money.
Wow.
So Hearst dispatched Bierce to Washington, D.C. with a very simple directive. Stop him using nothing but the power of the press.
And Bierce went completely scorched earth.
He was ruthless.
He attacked them relentlessly in print. He famously referred to Leland Stanford as Stealin' Lanford.
Which is pretty funny.
It is. He exposed every bribe, every backroom deal, every single instance of their greed. He made it impossible for the politicians to quietly pass the bill.
He really shined a spotlight on it.
Which led to this incredible, almost cinematic confrontation on the steps of the national Capitol.
Oh, this is one of the great moments in journalistic history. So Collis P. Huntington, a man who is used to simply buying his way out of any problem, corners Bierce on the steps of the Capitol.
Right.
Huntington looks at this journalist who has been making his life a living hell, and he asks Bierce to name his price.
He assumes he can just pay him off.
He is operating on the assumption that every man has a price.
And Bierce, fully aware that a crowd of politicians and reporters has gathered around to watch this showdown, replies loudly, quote, "My price is $75 million to be handed to the Treasurer of the United States."
It was a total public humiliation. Huntington had no response.
You can say anything.
Bierce's relentless coverage turned public opinion so fiercely against the railroad barons that the funding bill was actually defeated.
That's amazing.
Armed with nothing but sarcasm and ink, Bierce actually succeeded in changing the course of legislation and stopping a massive corporate theft.
You know, it's like having an investigative reporter with the cutting, cynical wit of a late-night satirist who has absolutely zero desire to be liked by anyone.
Who can care if you liked him?
He didn't care if you were offended, which is why his most famous piece of nonfiction, if you can call it that, is so brilliant. Let's talk about the Devil's Dictionary.
Oh, yes. The Devil's Dictionary started as an occasional column in the newspaper. It was eventually compiled into a book in 1906.
What was it originally called?
It was originally titled The Cynic's Word Book, mostly because publishers on the East Coast considered the word devil to be too controversial at the time.
Right, of course.
The premise is simple but devastating. It is a satirical lexicon that mocks politics, religion, high society, and human nature by providing brutally honest, alternative definitions for common English words.
We have to share some of these with you because the economy of language is staggering. For instance, he defines the word happiness as an agreeable sensation arising from contemplating the misery of another.
It is so bleak, but it perfectly highlights his view of inherent human selfishness.
Yeah.
His definition of a cynic is clearly a self-portrait. He defines it as a blackguard whose faulty vision sees things as they are, not as they ought to be.
Seeing things as they are, not as they ought to be. That is literally the thesis statement of his life.
Exactly.
And my personal favorite, his definition for the word alone. The definition is just 3 words. In bad company.
So good.
He agreed with Edgar Allan Poe that the novel was a bloated literary form that diluted emotional impact, so he actually refused to write novels. He wanted to pack the maximum amount of emotive power into the smallest possible space.
And, you know, it is important to note here, as we discuss his attacks on societal hypocrisy in the church, that we are analyzing these definitions purely to understand his historical and literary impact.
Absolutely.
We are impartially reporting the content of his satire, which spared absolutely no institution or political ideology, left or right. We aren't endorsing it, just laying it out.
Nobody was safe from his pen, that's for sure. But eventually, Bierce realized that journalism and satirical dictionaries could only accomplish so much.
They had limits.
Journalism could expose the corruption of human society, the greed of men like Huntington. But what about the terrifying randomness of the universe itself?
That requires a different tool.
Exactly. To tackle that, he had to return to fiction.
And in doing so, he bridged 2 massive eras of American literature. Stylistically and historically, Bierce stands directly between the Gothic, romantic dread of Edgar Allan Poe and the cosmic, uncaring horror of H.P. Lovecraft.
Lovecraft loved him, right?
Lovecraft was a massive admirer of Bierce, calling his fictional work grim and savage.
S.T. Joshi, the weird fiction scholar in our sources, defines Bierce's specific subgenre as satiric horror.
Satiric horror, I like that.
It's this wild concept where he uses irony, deadpan humor, and outright misanthropy to evoke a profound sense of fear. He takes incredibly gruesome situations and injects them with a weird, hysterical comedy.
A perfect example of this is the story My Favorite Murder.
Oh man, this story.
The Columbia Journalism Review refers to it as a marvelously curdled fairy tale.
Walk us through the plot of that one because it is just completely absurd.
So the story opens with a man standing trial before a judge. He is defending himself against the charge of murdering his own mother.
Okay, pretty dark.
But his defense strategy is entirely bizarre. He argues that he shouldn't be judged too harshly for killing his mother because he once committed a much better, far more complex and impressive murder years earlier.
What a defense.
Right. He proceeds to boast to the judge about the premeditated, brutal murder of his uncle.
And the method of the murder is completely insane.
It is. He tied his uncle up inside a large sack, hung the sack from the limb of a tree, and then deliberately riled up a highly aggressive ram.
A ram, like an animal.
An animal, yes. The ram repeatedly charged the sack, leaping into the air to deliver these devastating headbutts until the uncle was battered to death inside the bag.
Unbelievable.
And the narrator describes this entire process with the pride of an artisan detailing his finest craftsmanship.
Or consider the deadpan brilliance of One Summer Night.
Another classic.
It opens with a character named Henry Armstrong, who wakes up to find he has been buried alive. Now, being buried alive is the ultimate Edgar Allan Poe nightmare.
It's supposed to be pure, unadulterated terror.
Right. But Bierce twists the expectation. Armstrong realizes he is buried alive in a coffin, but he's actually suffering from a debilitating illness.
Okay.
So instead of panicking, he simply feels apathetic. He feels
Yeah.
utterly indifferent to his horrific fate and just goes back to sleep.
That's hilarious.
Meanwhile, above ground, a group of grave robbers are digging him up to sell his body to a local medical student.
As one does in the 19th century.
Exactly. When they break open the casket, Armstrong wakes up again and just casually sits up. The grave robbers are so terrified by the corpse coming to life that they run away screaming. But the medical student who hired them isn't fazed at all.
He's got a job to do.
He calmly takes out a heavy spade, bashes Armstrong's head in, and takes the body anyway.
It's incredibly bleak.
It is, but I have to ask you, why?
Why the humor?
Yeah, why does he use humor when describing such horrific, gruesome things? I mean, when you read about a man being beaten to death by a sheep, you catch yourself laughing, and then you immediately feel guilty for laughing. It feels inappropriate.
And that feeling of discomfort is exactly what he is trying to engineer. For Bierce, violence in literature was a form of combat against the American expectations of good taste and ethical rectitude.
He's fighting the reader.
He is. He uses comedic hysteria to force the reader to confront the utter randomness and absurdity of existence. He wants you to realize that the universe doesn't care about your dignity, your carefully laid plans, or your neat little life narratives.
It's very nihilist.
It is. Sometimes you survive the horrors of a war only to get bashed in the head with a shovel by a greedy medical student. The humor is just a delivery system for existential dread.
Which brings us really to the final chapter of his life.
The disappearance.
After a lifetime of writing stories about people trapped by cruel twists of fate, people whose realities suddenly snap into darkness, Ambrose Bierce orchestrated the greatest twist ending of all.
He really did. By 1913, Bierce was 71 years old. As we established earlier, he suffered from severe asthma, and he had endured a decade of profound personal tragedy.
What happened?
Well, his wife, Molly, divorced him in 1904 and died the very following year.
Yeah.
His eldest son, Day, committed suicide after a romantic rejection.
Awful.
And his other son, Lee, died of alcoholism-related pneumonia.
So he had outlived his entire family.
Yes.
He felt alienated from the changing literary scene in America, and he was just exhausted. So he decides to take a tour of his old Civil War battlefields. He visits Shiloh and Chickamauga, tracing the ghosts of his youth. From there, he heads down to the southern border and crosses into Mexico.
At a very chaotic time.
Right in the middle of the incredibly bloody Mexican Revolution. He attaches himself to Pancho Villa's army, supposedly as a journalistic observer.
And his correspondence from this period is deeply ominous. He wrote a letter to his close friend Blanche Partington from Chihuahua City, dated December 26, 1913.
What did it say?
He ends the letter with a sentence. As to me, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination.
An unknown destination. And he wrote an even more famous letter to his niece, Laura, right before crossing the border.
The euthanasia letter.
Yes, he wrote, "Goodbye. If you hear of my being stood up against a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags, please know that I think that a pretty good way to depart this life. It beats old age, disease, or falling down the cellar stairs. To be a gringo in Mexico, that is euthanasia."
And that letter was the last the world ever heard from him. He vanished without a trace.
Nobody was ever recovered. No confirmed account of his death was ever produced by any army or government.
It remains a total mystery.
So what actually happened to him? The LitHub article in our sources outlines 5 major theories that historians and true crime buffs have debated for over a century. Let's walk through them.
Sure.
Theory number 1 is suicide.
Right. This theory posits that the entire trip to Mexico was just an elaborate ruse. Bierce, weary from grief, his asthma, and his lifelong TBI complications, never actually intended to follow Pancho Villa.
So where did he go?
Instead, he used the chaotic backdrop of a revolution to throw everyone off his scent. He quietly wandered into the Grand Canyon, or perhaps Death Valley, to end his life on his own terms, in a place where his body would never be recovered.
It fits his secretive nature, honestly.
It does.
But theory number 2 is a lot more dramatic. Execution by Pancho Villa's firing squad.
Ah, yes.
A retired American priest named James Lehnert spent years investigating accounts from elderly locals in the Mexican town of Sierra Mojada. They claimed an old American was executed there as a spy. Yeah, Lehnert was so convinced by these local stories that in 2004, He actually erected a gravestone for Bierce in the local cemetery, declaring that he was executed and buried at this place.
It is a compelling piece of local lore, but there's no hard evidence to back it up.
Right. What's theory 3?
Theory number 3 shifts the blame away from Villa and onto the Mexican federales, the opposing army. An American soldier of fortune named Tex O'Reilly claimed in his autobiography that Bierce was shot dead by federal fighters in a cantina in Sierra Mojada before he ever met up with Villa.
A bar fight.
Essentially. O'Reilly claimed the federales assumed Bierce was a spy because he couldn't speak Spanish, shot him, and buried him in an unmarked grave. O'Reilly even claimed that he found 2 empty envelopes addressed to Ambrose Bierce hidden behind a rafter in the house where the American had been staying.
It's a great story, but it comes from a guy whose literal job title was soldier of fortune. So you really have to take his claims with a massive grain of salt.
Oh, a huge grain of salt.
Theory number 4 is much more grounded. It suggests he died of pneumonia in Texas.
Okay, walk me through that.
In 2002, a journalist investigated a claim that an old gringo who had been traveling with Mexican forces got sick, called himself Ambrosia, and paid some locals to smuggle him back into the United States.
Ambrosia?
Yeah, and this Ambrosia talked about writing books with the word devil in the title.
Well, that's specific.
Right. He supposedly died of pneumonia in January 1914 and was buried in an unmarked grave in Marfa, Texas.
Interesting. And finally, theory number 5, which the LitHub author includes playfully, he is still alive.
Hiding in a cave somewhere, beating the world record for human longevity by a full century.
I think we can probably rule that one out.
Yeah, probably. But the Columbia Journalism Review piece offers a meta-theory that I find absolutely fascinating. Biographer Roy Morris argues that Bierce's disappearance might not have been a random tragedy, but a deliberate act of fatalistic performance art.
Fatalistic performance art. How does a disappearance become performance art?
Well, think about his whole life. Bierce spent his entire career mocking the sentimental American public.
Right, the oyster shell.
He hated how readers always demanded a neat, tidy ending. A hero's death, a beautiful funeral, a clear narrative closure where everything makes sense.
He despised that.
So, according to this theory, he intentionally constructs his own death to be a permanent, unsolvable mystery. He actively deprives the public of a body, of an ending, of any kind of closure.
Wow.
It's like a magician doing their absolute greatest trick, stepping into the wooden cabinet on stage, pulling the curtain shut, and when they open it, he hasn't just disappeared through a trap door. He has actually ceased to exist.
It is a profoundly literary way to view the end of a life. And whether it was intentional performance art or just a chaotic death in a war zone, his vanishing cemented his legacy.
He became a myth.
He passed instantly into mythology. But while his body vanished, his literary DNA, his structural inventions, his cynical philosophy profoundly infiltrated the 20th century.
This is where we really need to dig in, because his influence is massive. We've talked about Hemingway and William Golding utilizing the swoon moment and fragmented time, but he was also a direct mentor to younger writers in California, like the poet George Sterling.
And his influence on the horror genre is truly foundational. Bierce wrote short stories like An Inhabitant of Carcosa and Hated the Shepherd.
What's significant about those?
In these stories, he invented specific names and mythologies, like the ruined ancient city of Carcosa, the dark lake of Hali, and a god named Hastur.
Wait, I know those names.
You do? A younger writer named Robert W. Chambers read these stories, was completely captivated by the eerie atmosphere, and borrowed those exact names for his own landmark 1895 horror collection, The King in Yellow.
And The King in Yellow directly inspired H.P. Lovecraft to create the entire Cthulhu mythos.
Exactly.
So that whole lineage of cosmic weird fiction traces its roots right back to Ambrose Bierce sitting at his desk in San Francisco.
It does. But perhaps the most profound tribute to Bierce's legacy and the most complex exploration of his disappearance is found in Carlos Fuentes' acclaimed 1985 novel, Gringo Viejo, or The Old Gringo.
Let's spend some time on this, because Fuentes doesn't just write a historical thriller about what might have happened in Mexico.
Oh, no, not at all.
He uses Bierce for a much larger thematic purpose.
Fuentes, who is a titan of Latin American literature, took the mystery of Bierce's disappearance and used it as the foundational centerpiece for the novel. He casts Bierce as the titular old gringo wandering through the Mexican Revolution.
Okay.
But Fuentes is using Bierce as the ultimate walking symbol of the United States.
How does Bierce symbolize the U.S. in this context?
The old gringo in the novel represents a country with a deeply fragmented consciousness, A country that is built on high-minded ideals, but is constantly haunted by its own violence and imperialism.
Right.
Fuentes uses Bierce to critique American interventionism and manifest destiny in Latin America. But he does it by drawing brilliant, intricate parallels between Bierce's Civil War trauma and the social trauma of the Mexican Revolution.
I know Fuente specifically references one of Bierce's most famous stories in the book, A Horseman in the Sky.
Yes. A Horseman in the Sky is a story where a Union soldier named Carter Drews is on picket duty.
Okay.
He sees an enemy Confederate scout on a cliff edge. He is forced to shoot the scout to protect his regiment, only to realize as the man falls that the scout he just killed was his own father.
Oh, that's brutal.
It's a profound Oedipal conflict. The tragedy of having to kill the father figure to forge a new nation. Fuentes takes that exact conflict and maps it directly onto the Mexican Revolution.
How so?
The young Mexican revolutionaries, like the character Tomas Arroyo, are engaged in the exact same process. They are violently destroying the old paternalistic social order of the hacienda system to birth a New Mexico.
Fuentes is showing that Bierce's understanding of war transcends the American Civil War. The trauma is universal.
It is.
The novel also constantly references Bierce's fragmented reality. The idea from Owl Creek Dodge that a man can be hanging from a noose and dreaming of escape, all in the same eternal instant. Fuentes understood that Bierce's insistence on breaking time and narrative wasn't just a clever gimmick. It was a philosophy of how history and trauma actually operate on the human soul.
Bierce paved the way for writers like Stephen Crane to write The Red Badge of Courage, and he laid the groundwork for the unvarnished modernism of the Lost Generation.
He really did.
He stripped away the romance of the 19th century, leaving only the stark, absurd reality of the 20th century.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've traced the life of a farm boy from Ohio who survived the mud and blood of Shiloh and Kennesaw Mountain.
Yeah, what a journey.
We've seen how a sniper's bullet fundamentally altered his perception of time, leading him to invent modern psychological horror. We've watched him tear down the corrupt robber barons of the Gilded Age with nothing but a pen.
A very sharp pen.
And we've followed him all the way to the Mexican desert, where he engineered his own mythological exit. He was a man who bent the literary rules of time, and he refused to let his readers sleep peacefully.
And if we look at the totality of his life and his disappearance, it leaves us with a rather provocative thought to mull over.
What's that?
We live in a modern era that is completely obsessed with true crime, with uncovering secrets, and above all, finding closure.
Oh, yeah, we love closure.
We demand that every mystery be solved, and every narrative tied up with a neat little bow. But Bierce spent his entire life writing stories that explicitly refused to give the reader a comforting, happy resolution.
Right.
So by disappearing without a trace, by denying us a grave to visit or a final chapter to read, did Ambrose Bierce turn his own death into his final masterpiece.
Did he vanish precisely to prove that our modern, desperate obsession with finding closure is exactly the kind of sentimental, comforting delusion he spent his entire life mocking?
It's very possible.
That is a haunting thought. He left us standing in the muddy waters of his legacy, looking for a clear answer that he made sure we would never, ever find. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the life of Ambrose Bierce. We'll be back next time to unpack another fascinating corner of history. Until then, keep questioning the narrative.